Somewhere in the world right now, a ship is passing through a corridor so narrow that its captain can see two countries at the same time. To the north, the mountains of Iran rise from the waterline in dark, jagged ridges, their slopes catching the light of whatever hour it happens to be. To the south, the rocky tip of Oman's Musandam Peninsula juts into the sea like a closed fist. Between them, the distance is 21 nautical miles. That is roughly 39 kilometers. You could drive it in under half an hour on a decent highway. You could, on a clear morning, almost see from one shore to the other without binoculars. It is a distance so modest that on most world maps, the strait barely registers as a gap at all. And through this modest gap in the coastline, every single day passes approximately 1/5 of all the petroleum the human world consumes. That number deserves a moment to settle. 20 million barrels of oil per day, crude, condensate, refined fuel, liquefied natural gas, all of it squeezed through two designated shipping lanes, each only 2 nautical miles wide, separated by a slim buffer zone. The largest vessels on Earth, supertankers stretching 300 meters or more, file through this corridor like freight trains through a mountain pass, their hulls drawing so deep beneath the water line that the margin between keel and seafloor narrows to something uncomfortably thin. In peacetime, roughly 153 vessels make this transit every day. That is about 6 ships per hour. A slow, continuous procession of steel and fuel carrying the energy that lights cities, heats homes, fuels factories, and feeds the chemical processes that produce fertilizer, plastic, and medicine across half the globe. If this corridor closes, even briefly, the consequences do not creep. They detonate. Oil prices spike within hours. Insurance markets freeze. Shipping companies reroute or simply refuse to sail. Supply chains that depend on Gulf energy, which is to say most of the major supply chains that sustain modern industrial life across Asia, Europe, and beyond, begin to stall, stutter, and fracture. The loss of this single passage does not merely inconvenience the global economy, it seizes it by the throat. And the unsettling truth is that nothing about this vulnerability is theoretical. It is not a model. It is not a simulation. It is a live condition ticking quietly beneath the surface of ordinary life under every single day. And here is the contradiction that makes this story so strange. The nation best positioned to close the Strait of Hormuz is Iran. Its northern coastline commands the passage. Its military has spent decades developing the exact tools needed to deny transit. Sea mines that can be laid from civilian fishing boats under cover of darkness. Fast attack craft armed with rockets and torpedoes. Coastal anti-ship missiles concealed in the mountain folds overlooking the strait. Swarms of reconnaissance drones capable of tracking every vessel in the corridor, and even miniature submarines designed to operate in the strait's shallow and confined waters. Iranian officials have repeatedly and publicly threatened to shut the strait, usually during moments of acute geopolitical tension, as though reaching for a valve on the world's energy supply. And yet Iran's own oil exports and the financial lifeblood of its government flow through the very same water. Its food imports arrive by the same route. Its economic survival depends on the corridor it threatens to destroy. To close Hormuz fully would be an act of extraordinary self-destruction, economic suicide dressed as strategic leverage. The threat is simultaneously terrifying and paradoxical. Iran promises to block a corridor that it itself cannot survive without. The world has learned somewhat uneasily to live with this contradiction. It has become background noise, a strategic fact that everyone acknowledges and no one has resolved. Analysts call the strait a choke point and publish annual risk assessments. Economists model the disruption scenarios and assign them probabilities. Navies patrol the Gulf and its approaches in expensive, perpetual rotations. Insurance underwriters adjust their premiums quarter by quarter and quietly hope that the numbers hold for another year. But beneath the familiar language of risk assessment and strategic posturing, there is a deeper strangeness that most coverage of the strait never reaches. Because the power of this corridor is not new. It did not begin with petroleum. It did not begin with tankers or missiles or Cold War naval strategy. The Strait of Hormuz has been the single most critical maritime passage between the Persian Gulf and the open ocean for at least 5,000 years. Copper, spices, silk, pearls, teak, long before the first barrel of crude was ever pumped from beneath the desert floor. One day, this narrow channel was already shaping the fate of civilizations. Empires rose by controlling it. Kingdoms grew fabulously wealthy by taxing the ships that passed through its waters. And every single one of those powers, without exception, eventually lost its grip. The strait outlasted them all. Oil is only the latest commodity to make this corridor indispensable. The pattern beneath the oil is far older and far more unsettling. It suggests that there is something about the geometry itself, about what happens when global trade is forced through a passage narrow enough to be threatened by whoever happens to sit on its shores, that no technology, no navy, and no diplomatic framework has ever permanently solved. Each generation arrives with new weapons, new alliances, and new confidence, and each generation discovers, usually in a moment of crisis, that the corridor still holds the final card. That is the story we are going to trace. Not just the modern crisis, though the modern crisis is real and unfolding even now, with consequences that are still rippling outward across global markets and foreign ministries. But the longer arc beneath it, the 5,000-year record of what happens when the world's most vital trade routes pass through a corridor barely wider than a large lake. How coastal actors with modest militaries have repeatedly brought far greater powers to negotiation, to payment, and sometimes to open war. How the illusion of mastery reasserts itself with each new generation of ships and weapons and strategic doctrines, and how the geography, indifferent and endlessly patient, keeps winning. 21 nautical miles, wide enough for the world's economy, narrow enough for a single mind to close. To understand why this small strip of water holds so much power, you first have to see it not on a political map, but as a physical space, because the geography itself is the weapon. Start with Iran's northern shore, the Zagros Mountains, one of the longest and most formidable mountain ranges in the Middle East. Descend toward the coast in a series of steep, ridged folds that have been pushed upward over millions of years by the collision of tectonic plates. Where they meet the water, the coastline is rugged, deeply indented, and riddled with small inlets, rocky coves, and narrow ravines that cut back into the hills like knife wounds. Cliffs drop sharply to the sea. There are few beaches, few gentle approaches. The terrain is, by its very nature, defensive. If you wanted to hide a missile launcher, a radar installation, or a battery of anti-ship cruise missiles within easy striking range of passing tankers, you could hardly design a better landscape. The mountains provide concealment. The elevation provides line of sight over the water below, and the distance from the nearest hidden cove to the center of the shipping lanes is at most a few dozen kilometers, in some places considerably less. Now look south. The Musandam Peninsula, a detached enclave of Oman, separated from the rest of the country by a wedge of the United Arab Emirates, reaches northward into the strait like a bent arm. Its coastline is dramatic and deeply carved, steep fjords slicing into the ancient and heavily weathered rock, remote fishing villages clinging to narrow strips of shore, waters so deep close to land that large vessels can pass surprisingly near the base of the cliffs. The peninsula is sparsely populated and has been for centuries, but its geological significance is immense because this jutting mass of limestone is what creates the narrowing. Without it, the Gulf would open gradually into the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea through a wide, comfortable, easily navigable mouth. Instead, Musandam pinches the passage shut, forcing all maritime traffic through a constricted corridor squeezed between two mountainous, watchful coasts. Within that corridor, the shipping lanes are not just narrow, they are fixed. The traffic separation scheme, internationally agreed upon and monitored by maritime authorities, designates two lanes, one inbound, one outbound, each 2 nautical miles wide, some days separated by a 2 nautical mile buffer zone. Vessels transiting the strait are expected to stay within their assigned lane. Deviation risks collision with oncoming traffic, grounding on shallow margins, or worse. For supertankers fully loaded with crude oil, drawing 20 meters or more beneath the waterline, the deepwater channel is effectively narrower still. The seabed rises in places. Shoals and submerged ridges lurk just outside the designated lanes. A ship that strays even slightly from the prescribed path enters uncertain and potentially dangerous depth. The margin for error for a vessel carrying 250,000 metric tons of crude oil through a corridor bounded by hostile coastline is remarkably slim. In peacetime, the system works with quiet mechanical precision. 153 transits per day, on average, roughly 6 per hour. A constant, stately parade of some of the largest moving objects humans have ever constructed, gliding through a gap that from the bridge of one of those ships feels startlingly intimate. Captains who have made the passage describe it in terms that sound almost physical. Claustrophobic is a word that comes up. You can see the other coast, you can see the ships ahead of you and behind. You're aware at every moment that the world's energy supply is being threaded through a needle and that you and your vessel are part of the thread. But it is not only oil that threads through. Liquefied natural gas from Qatar, one of the world's largest producers of LNG, exits the Gulf through Hormuz. So do petrochemical feedstocks, the raw molecular ingredients for plastics, pharmaceuticals, synthetic fabrics, and industrial chemicals of every description. These follow the same narrow path, aboard the same types of tankers, through the same 2 shipping lanes. And critically, also transiting the strait are the precursors for agricultural fertilizer. Ammonia and urea produced in Gulf states travel through Hormuz to reach farming markets across South and East Asia, where they are applied to fields that feed billions of people. This is a detail, that almost never makes headlines, but its implications are enormous and deeply underappreciated. A disruption at Hormuz does not only affect the price of gasoline at a filling station, it quietly and inevitably affects the price of food. The same corridor that carries energy also carries the chemical foundation of global agriculture. Linking Gulf hydrocarbons to rice paddies in India and wheat fields in China through an invisible chain of molecular dependency that most people never think about, never notice, and never worry over until the moment it breaks. All of this volume, all of this value, all of this fragile complexity passes through a space where a single disabled vessel blocking a lane, a small cluster of naval mines sewn across the channel floor, or a few well-placed anti-ship missile strikes could halt traffic for days, weeks, or longer. And this is where the geometry of the strait reveals its deeper and more troubling logic, a logic that is not ultimately about oil or politics or any particular crisis, but about the fundamental physics of what happens when power meets confined space. In open ocean, a great navy dominates. Aircraft carriers, guided missile destroyers, nuclear submarines, electronic warfare platforms. These are instruments of power projection designed to control vast expanses of water. The stronger your fleet, the more ocean you can command. Open water rewards size, range, and technological sophistication. But in a choke point, that equation inverts. The confined space neutralizes much of what makes a large and powerful navy powerful. Big warships become large, slow targets rather than mobile threats. Their maneuverability is constrained by shallow water, narrow channels, and the constant presence of commercial traffic they are supposed to be protecting. Their surveillance must cover every meter of nearby coastline, every inlet, every cove and ravine where a small boat or a mobile coastal launcher might be concealed. Meanwhile, the defender, the nation sitting on the shore of the Narrows, needs only cheap, plentiful, and disposable denial weapons. Mines are inexpensive to manufacture and agonizingly slow to clear from confined waters. Fast attack craft can swarm from hidden coves, launch their ordnance, and retreat before a capital ship can meaningfully respond. Shore-based anti-ship cruise missiles, fired from mobile launchers concealed among the ridges and valleys of the Zagros, can strike a tanker in the shipping lane and vanish back into the folds of the mountains before the smoke and debris have cleared the surface of the water. This is the asymmetry that makes choke points so persistently dangerous and so resistant to the kinds of solutions that work in open water. The defender does not need to win a naval battle. The defender does not need to match the attacker ship for ship, or missile for missile, or dollar for dollar. The defender only needs to make transit risky enough, unpredictable enough, and costly enough that the ships stop coming. That threshold is far lower than most people assume. A handful of mines in the right position, a few missiles fired from hidden launchers, even the credible rumor of either can be enough. The cost of denial is low. The cost of assured protection is immense. And the burden of proof falls entirely and permanently on the side that needs the corridor to remain open and functioning. This asymmetry is not a product of modern warfare or modern technology. It is a product of the geography itself, written into the shape of the coastline and the depth of the water. The same mountains that conceal today's missile batteries once hid signal fires that warned coastal settlements of approaching fleets. The same rocky inlets that shelter modern fast attack boats once sheltered pirate dhows and armed privateers in earlier centuries. The same narrow lanes that supertankers must follow today are the descendants of the same channels that ancient merchant vessels hugged close to shore, vulnerable to the same kinds of threats from the same watchful shores. The weapons change with every passing century. The geometry does not. And it is the geometry in every era, quiet and indifferent, that has the final word. That geometry has been shaping the fortunes of whoever controls this corridor for a very long time, 5,000 years at minimum. Long before anyone standing on those rocky slopes had the slightest suspicion that beneath the seafloor of the Gulf lay the largest accessible concentration of hydrocarbons on the planet. Back when the most valuable cargo passing through these waters was copper ore from Oman's interior and blue lapis lazuli from the distant mountains of Afghanistan. Back when the empires at stake were Sumer and Harappa, not Washington and Tehran, that structural asymmetry, the weak leveraging geography against the strong, did not begin with missiles and oil tankers. It began with copper ingots and wooden dhows more than 4,000 years ago. Around 2,600 years before the Common Era, while the pyramids of Egypt were still relatively new constructions on the edge of the Sahara, the world's first long-distance maritime trade network was already threading through this corridor. We know this not from legend, but from physical evidence. Cuneiform tablets from southern Mesopotamia, the wedge-shaped script pressed into soft clay by Sumerian scribes, describe a place called Magan. Magan has been widely identified by archaeologists as the coastal region of what is now Oman, a land rich in copper ore that could be mined from the mountains of the interior and shipped westward through the strait into the Persian Gulf. At the far end of the same trade network lay the Indus Valley, home to the Harappan civilization, whose merchant vessels carried teak, ivory, carnelian beads, polished shell ornaments, and finished cotton goods along the coasts of what is now Pakistan and Western India. But it is between these two great Bronze Age economies. The strait served as the mandatory passage. There was no alternative sea route. There was no canal cut through the intervening land. The geography demanded that all seaborne commerce between the Gulf and the Indian Ocean pass through the same narrow corridor, then precisely as it demands it now. These were not casual, accidental voyages made by fishermen who drifted too far from shore. The scale of Bronze Age Gulf trade, while modest by modern standards, was remarkably organized and sustained over centuries. Archaeologists have uncovered standardized weights and measures at sites on both sides of the corridor, evidence of agreed-upon commercial conventions and long-standing trading partnerships. Harappan seals, the small carved stamps used to mark ownership and authenticate goods, now have been found in Mesopotamian cities hundreds of kilometers from the Indus Valley. Mesopotamian goods, in turn, have appeared at Harappan sites. The exchange was real, regular, and commercially sophisticated. It followed established routes. It involved intermediary ports, and every stage of that network was routed through the same narrow waterway that would, millennia later, carry the world's crude oil. The commodities changed beyond all recognition. The corridor did not. Even at this earliest documented stage, the strait was not merely a passive feature of the landscape, a gap that ships happened to pass through. It was functional infrastructure. It was the one corridor that connected the Gulf's enclosed interior waters to the vast open reaches of the Indian Ocean trading world beyond. And already, long before any formal kingdom or organized state claimed authority over the passage, the people who lived along its shores understood the value of their position. Coastal communities at the mouth of the Gulf were situated to provide passing vessels with fresh water, dried fish, navigational knowledge, and safe anchorage in sheltered coves. In a world without sea charts, without lighthouses, without any of the navigational technology that later centuries would slowly develop, the simple act of guiding a foreign merchant ship through an unfamiliar strait, pointing out the safe channels, the hidden rocks, the places where currents ran treacherously fast, was a valuable service, one worth paying for. Tolls, in the earliest and most informal sense, were already being collected. not by governments or royal treasuries, but by the geography itself, which channeled all traffic past communities that could extract value simply by sitting in the right place at the right moment and knowing the water better than anyone passing through. The Sumerians, whose city-states along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers depended on imported copper to fuel their rapidly expanding bronze industry, were among the first major civilizations to feel this dependency deeply, and they wrote about it. Clay tablets from the ancient city of Ur describe trade expeditions dispatched to Dilmun, a transshipment hub generally identified by scholars as the island of modern Bahrain, which served as the great commercial way station for Gulf maritime commerce. Goods from Megan and the distant Indus Valley were gathered at Dilmun, consolidated, rows, and then sent onward to the river ports of Mesopotamia. And all of it, every copper ingot and every bale of cotton cloth, had passed first through the strait. The Sumerians did not call it Hormuz. They may not have had a formal name for the passage at all, but they understood the bottleneck intimately. Their merchants paid the prices that geography imposed. Their scribes recorded the transactions. Their records are, in a very real sense, the first written documentation of the strait's structural power over the civilizations that depended on it. Centuries passed. The Bronze Age gave way to the Iron Age. Empires rose and fell along the rivers of Mesopotamia and the coasts of the Gulf. Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians, each in turn depended to varying degrees on maritime trade that transited the strait. The details of their engagement with the corridor are often fragmentary, surviving only in scattered textual references and partial archaeological records that become harder to interpret the further back you reach. But the pattern, even through the gaps, holds firm. Whenever a major civilization occupied the land surrounding the Persian Gulf, its economy oriented naturally toward the water, and the water inescapably funneled through the same 21-mile gap between the mountains and the peninsula. Then, in 325, before the Common Era, a fleet arrived from the west carrying a very different kind of ambition. Alexander the Great had conquered the Persian Empire. His dominion stretched from Greece to the borders of India, and as part of his effort to bind that empire together through naval routes as well as overland roads, he dispatched his admiral, Nearchus, on a remarkable voyage from the mouth of the Indus River westward through the Arabian Sea and into the Persian Gulf, mapping the coastline as he went. His account, preserved through the writings of later Greek historians, constitutes the first detailed written description of the strait and the waters surrounding it. He documented the currents, the seasonal winds, the settlements along the shore, the quality of various anchorages. He noted the narrowness of the passage and the dependence of all Gulf commerce on this single maritime exit. What Nearchus found when he arrived was not a wilderness. It was not an empty, forgotten corridor waiting to be discovered by a Greek explorer. It was a passage already thick with human activity, accumulated knowledge, and quiet confidence. Fishing communities, trading posts, small harbors tucked into the coastal rock, and people who had been living on the economics of the strait for generations upon generations before any Western admiral thought to write it all down. His survey did not discover the strait's strategic importance. It merely recorded, for the first time in a literary form that happened to survive the centuries, what the people of the Gulf had always known. This water was the hinge on which their world turned. Everything that entered or left the Gulf by sea passed through here. And whoever truly understood that fact, whoever positioned themselves at the right point along this corridor, held a quiet and persistent advantage over every empire, every trader, and every fleet that depended on it from a comfortable distance. The broader lesson is one that modern strategists and energy analysts often miss in their understandable focus on petroleum and its geopolitics. For at least 2 full millennia before anyone on Earth knew that oil existed beneath the floor of the Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz was already performing the same essential structural function it performs today. It was the sole maritime exit from one of the ancient world's richest economic basins into the open ocean. It was narrow enough to be threatened by local actors. It was essential enough to be indispensable to distant powers, and it was geographically permanent. Nothing that human beings did or built across those long centuries, no canal, no overland caravan route, no alternative port or passage, Duash, changed the fundamental fact that if you wanted to move goods between the Gulf and the Indian Ocean by sea, you went through this corridor or you did not go at all. And in that permanence lay a kind of standing invitation. If the strait was always going to be the mandatory passage, then controlling it, or even simply sitting near it and extracting value from the ceaseless flow of passing traffic, was always going to be one of the most reliable economic strategies available to anyone ambitious enough, patient enough, or desperate enough to try. For centuries, that leverage stayed informal. Coastal villages provisioning ships and guiding them through dangerous waters. Small local powers taxing the trade they could not themselves generate. But eventually someone looked at this corridor and saw the full scope of what it offered. Someone understood that this narrow passage was not just a fact of geography, but an economic engine of extraordinary and renewable power, and that building an entire kingdom on its control would be worth more than holding any amount of surrounding land. That kingdom's name still echoes in the strait itself. Between roughly the 10th and 17th centuries of the Common Era, something remarkable took shape at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. Not a great continental empire backed by cavalry and siege engines. Not a military dynasty commanding vast conscript armies across fertile plains. Something stranger and, in its own quiet way, far more instructive about how power actually works in narrow places. A small island kingdom perched on a barren rock in one of the hottest and most inhospitable stretches of water on Earth became one of the wealthiest places in the entire medieval world. Its power did not come from fertile land because it had almost none. The island was largely rock, salt flat, and sun-baked earth. It did not come from mineral riches buried beneath its soil because there were no significant deposits to speak of. It did not come from a large population or a fearsome military force because the kingdom was never anything more than a modest city-state surrounded on all sides by far bigger and more conventionally powerful neighbors. Its power came from a single, inexhaustible, and geographically permanent asset: position. The kingdom was called Hormuz, and if that name sounds familiar, it should, because the strait that still bears its echo, Hormuz, is the last surviving trace of a civilization that most people alive today have never heard of, and that most history books no longer bother to mention. Hormuz occupied an island at the entrance to the Persian Gulf, just inside the strait's southern approaches. The island itself was small, arid, and punishing in ways that are difficult to overstate. Summer temperatures could reach extremes that made outdoor labor genuinely dangerous for much of the day. Fresh water was scarce and had to be imported from the mainland, or collected with enormous effort from shallow wells and cisterns. The soil was thin and mineral poor, capable of growing almost nothing useful in any quantity. By any conventional measure of habitability or agricultural promise, it was one of the least inviting places in the entire region to build a permanent settlement, um, let alone a prosperous city, let alone a kingdom renowned across the trading world. And yet, Ormus thrived, not despite its location, but entirely and specifically because of it. The island sat at the precise geographical point where every vessel entering or leaving the Persian Gulf had no choice but to pass within sight of its walls. From the Indian Ocean side, merchant ships bearing spices, textiles, precious stones, teak, ivory, and manufactured goods from India, East Africa, and the distant markets of Southeast Asia converged on the strait's approaches and funneled through the corridor. From the Gulf side, Arab and Persian traders carried pearls harvested from the Gulf's shallow oyster beds, horses bred for export to Indian armies, dates from the plantations of Mesopotamia, and the products of Central Asian caravan routes that terminated at Gulf ports. All of this traffic, eastbound and westbound, was channeled by the same immutable geography we have already traced through the same narrow waterway that Ormus commanded simply by being located exactly where it was. The kingdom's wealth was built almost entirely on this convergence of routes. Ormus did not manufacture goods in any great quantity. It did not grow food for export. It did not possess workshops or factories that produced finished products for distant markets. What it did with extraordinary and sustained effectiveness over several centuries was broker, store, tax, and facilitate the passage of other people's commerce. It was a toll booth dressed as a city, a customs house elevated to the status of a kingdom. Ships arriving from distant ports would anchor in the island's harbor, offload their cargoes into bonded warehouses, negotiate prices with merchants drawn from a dozen different cultures and trading traditions, pay customs duties to the kingdom's rulers, and then reload their vessels for the next leg of their journey. The harbor was, by contemporary accounts preserved in the writings of travelers and chroniclers, a polyglot spectacle unlike almost anything else in the medieval world. Arab traders, Persian officials, Indian merchants from Gujarat and Malabar, occasional Chinese envoys following the maritime silk routes, and East African sailors from the Swahili coast crowded the docks and the covered markets, and conducting business in multiple languages and currencies under a sun that bleached the stone buildings white and turned the harbor water a brilliant, almost unreal blue. Travelers who visited Ormus in its prime described it in terms that bordered on disbelief. The wealth was visible, abundant, and deliberately ostentatious. Silks, jewels, and rare spices filled the market stalls in quantities that suggested not a frontier outpost, but a global crossroads. The ruling family lived lavishly, their court sustained by customs revenues that flowed as reliably as the tides. And those revenues were enormous because every bale, every chest, and every cask that moved between the Gulf and the Indian Ocean world owed a percentage to the island's treasury. Under one medieval chronicler called Ormus one of the greatest commercial centers in the known world. Another described it as a place where the wealth of nations was gathered and redistributed according to the logic of the water itself. These descriptions were not literary embellishment. They were the natural result of what happens when all trade must pass through a single controllable point, and when the entity sitting at that point understands exactly what it possesses. The deeper lesson of Ormus is not simply that it was rich. Many places in the medieval world were rich. The lesson is specifically why and how it was rich, because the mechanism it relied upon is the same mechanism that makes the strait dangerous today. The kingdom did not need to conquer territory. It did not need to field armies or project power across vast distances or subdue foreign populations. It needed only to maintain control of the harbor, keep the customs houses functioning, ensure that the merchants of the world found it more convenient and more profitable to pay the toll than to seek some alternative route that, in practical terms, did not exist. There was no meaningful alternative. The strait was the sole maritime passage between the Gulf and the open ocean. Ormus sat on that passage, and so the wealth flowed in reliably year after year, century after century, as predictable as the monsoon winds that carried the ships. This is the same structural logic that makes the strait a geopolitical flashpoint today, scaled down to a medieval city-state and stripped of its modern technological complexity. The fundamental mechanism is identical: a narrow passage with no practical bypass, and a local actor extracting value from global trade flows simply by controlling the bottleneck. The commodity has changed from silk and pearls to crude oil and liquefied natural gas. The scale has multiplied by orders of magnitude that would have astonished even the wealthiest Ormus merchant. But the underlying geometry and the quiet leverage it grants to whoever sits at the corridor's edge has not shifted by a single degree. And here is the hidden truth that makes this chapter of the Strait's history feel almost ghostly in its resonance with the present day. The kingdom of Ormus has been almost completely erased from modern awareness and modern memory. It does not appear in most standard history curricula taught in Western or Asian schools. It is not referenced in most popular accounts of Middle Eastern or maritime history. The island itself, now called Hormuz Island and administered by Iran, is a quiet, sparsely populated place visited mainly by curious travelers, occasional archaeologists, and Iranian tourists drawn by the island's strange red and ochre soil and the crumbling Portuguese fortress that came later. The harbor that once hosted the bustling commerce of half the known world is empty. If you walked the island today, nothing about the landscape would suggest that this was once among the wealthiest and most cosmopolitan places on the face of the earth. But the name survived: Hormuz. It is there every time a news anchor mentions the strait, every time an energy analyst calculates the risk premium for Gulf shipping, and every time a naval commander briefs a fleet on transit security through the corridor. The word itself is a fossil, a linguistic ghost, the last visible remnant of a kingdom that proved, centuries before anyone imagined tanker wars or insurance blockades or drone swarms, that controlling this particular passage was worth more than controlling almost anything else, that you did not need to be powerful in the conventional military or demographic sense to extract enormous value from the world. You just needed to sit in the right 39-kilometer corridor and wait with patience for the world to come to you. Ormus eventually fell, of course, not to a neighboring rival or an internal collapse brought on by decadence or succession crisis, but to a force from beyond the horizon, a force that believed its revolutionary new technology. Ocean-going warships, armed with gunpowder artillery, had finally solved the ancient problem of distant maritime control. That it could seize the strait, hold it indefinitely by force, and monopolize Gulf trade from a stone fortress perched on the very island that Ormus had made famous. The force was Portugal, and the experiment it conducted at Hormuz would last for over a century before the geography, patient and indifferent as ever, had its say once more. Ormus thrived for centuries on the principle that geography trumps military power. In 1507, a Portuguese fleet arrived to test that principle with artillery and iron. The Portuguese arrived at Hormuz not by accident, but by grand strategic design. Their entire vision for the Indian Ocean, conceived in Lisbon and executed across thousands of miles of unfamiliar water, rested on a single elegant insight. If you could seize the key choke points that controlled maritime trade between Asia, Africa, and Europe, you did not need to conquer vast territories or govern foreign populations. You needed only to hold the narrow places, the straits and harbor mouths where all commerce was forced to converge, and extract your share of everything that passed through. It was the Ormus model scaled up to an oceanic empire, and the Strait of Hormuz was recognized even then as one of the most valuable choke points on the planet. In 1507, a small Portuguese fleet under the command of Afonso de Albuquerque appeared in the waters off Hormuz Island. Albuquerque was not a diplomat or a cautious negotiator. He was a naval commander of exceptional ambition and considerable ruthlessness, operating under direct orders from the Portuguese crown to establish permanent and unchallengeable control over the Gulf's entrance. His fleet was modest in number, a handful of armed carracks and caravels, but the ships carried something that no regional maritime power at the time could effectively counter: heavy naval cannon, European gunpowder artillery, mounted on purpose-built warships with reinforced hulls designed to absorb the recoil of sustained broadside fire, represented a qualitative leap in the ability to project concentrated destructive force from the water. Local fleets in the Gulf, built primarily for speed, coastal navigation, and the transport of trade goods rather than for sustained naval bombardment, had no effective answer to this kind of assault. The initial encounter was violent and militarily decisive. De Albuquerque's guns shattered the defending vessels in the harbor and bombarded the island's waterfront positions with an intensity that the defenders had never experienced. The kingdom of Ormus, which had survived and prospered for centuries through commerce, diplomacy, and the strategic manipulation of trade relationships rather than through military force, was not equipped to resist this kind of direct assault. Local diplomatic maneuvers and a series of temporary setbacks delayed the full Portuguese occupation by several years, but by 1515, the takeover was complete and fortified. The Portuguese constructed a massive stone fortress on Hormuz Island, a brooding, thick-walled structure designed not merely for military defense, but as a visible and permanent statement of European dominion over the corridor. And in from this fortress and its harbor, Portuguese officials controlled the customs house, the anchorage, and the flow of every commercial vessel entering or leaving the Persian Gulf. For 115 years, the Portuguese held the strait. It was the longest sustained period of direct foreign military control over this corridor in all of recorded history. During that long century and more, the monopoly functioned much as the old Ormus system had, but with a harder, more coercive edge. Portuguese officials levied customs duties on virtually all Gulf trade. Ships that refused to carry Portuguese cartazes, the official passes granting permission to trade and sail in waters that Portugal now claimed to control, risked seizure, confiscation of cargo, or outright destruction. These merchant captains, who had previously paid voluntary tolls to the Ormus Customs House, now paid compulsory taxes to a foreign garrison backed by cannon. The revenues were substantial, funding Portuguese operations across the wider Indian Ocean network and enriching the royal treasury back in Lisbon. The fortress at Hormuz became one of the critical anchors of the Estado da India, the far-flung chain of fortified trading posts and naval bases that constituted Portugal's seaborne empire from the coast of East Africa to the harbors of Macau and the Spice Islands. But from the very beginning, the occupation carried the seeds of its eventual failure. The Portuguese garrison on Hormuz Island was always small, always dependent on resupply from distant bases strung across thousands of miles of ocean, um, and always surrounded by regional powers that deeply resented the foreign monopoly and the violence that enforced it. The Safavid dynasty in Persia, which had unified Iran into a powerful state, viewed Portuguese control of Hormuz as both an economic insult and a strategic provocation on its own doorstep. The Ottoman Empire periodically contested Portuguese influence through naval expeditions and proxy support for local resistance. Even smaller Arab maritime communities, whose traditional livelihoods in trade and fishing were disrupted by the monopoly, waged persistent resistance through smuggling, evasion, and occasional armed confrontation with Portuguese patrols. The Portuguese held on through technological superiority, the willingness to deploy extreme and exemplary violence against those who challenged their authority, and the simple fact that no single regional power was strong enough to dislodge them alone. But technology does not remain exclusive forever, and the ambitions of rival powers do not sleep while you fortify your walls. By the early 17th century, a new European competitor had arrived in the Indian Ocean with commercial ambitions that directly threatened the Portuguese monopoly. The English East India Company, commercially aggressive and increasingly capable at sea, found a natural and strategically convenient ally in Safavid Persia. Both parties had clear and complementary reasons to want the Portuguese expelled from Hormuz. Persia wanted to reclaim its own coastline, restore its customs revenues, and remove a foreign military presence from what it considered sovereign waters. And the English wanted access to the Gulf's lucrative trading networks that the Portuguese monopoly had effectively barred them from for over a century. The interests aligned perfectly. Neither could have dislodged the Portuguese alone. Together, they possessed the necessary combination of land forces and naval firepower to do what neither could accomplish independently. In 1622, the alliance struck. A combined force of Safavid Persian troops and English East India Company warships besieged the Portuguese fortress on Hormuz Island. The siege was not prolonged or dramatic. The garrison, isolated and entirely unable to receive reinforcements in time, capitulated. The Portuguese were expelled. The fortress that had symbolized European dominion over the strait for over a century was abandoned and left to decay in the salt air and punishing Gulf sun. Hormuz Island declined within a few generations into a quiet fishing settlement, its crumbling walls visited only by the wind. The fall of Portuguese Hormuz is one of those historical episodes that occupies barely a paragraph in most world history textbooks, but carries an outsized and deeply relevant lesson for anyone paying close attention to the specific dynamics of this particular corridor. Portugal had possessed the most advanced naval technology of its era. Its gunpowder warships had been genuinely revolutionary, capable of dominating any regional fleet they encountered in open water. It had held the strait by continuous military force. Yidu, for longer than any previous or subsequent occupier, it had extracted enormous wealth from the position, and it had still lost, not because its cannons stopped working or because some single decisive battlefield defeat shattered its capacity overnight. It lost because maintaining permanent control over a distant choke point against the sustained and patient resistance of local and regional actors who could draw on shorter supply lines, deeper familiarity with the waters, and the slow accumulation of shared grievances is a project that no distant power has ever sustained indefinitely. The geography does not tire. The garrison eventually always does. This is the pattern that the historical record traces with striking consistency across centuries at this specific corridor. Um, and it is worth stating with absolute clarity because it will repeat in different technological dress and under different flags in every subsequent era of the Strait's long history. Every major external power that has attempted to assert lasting control over the Strait of Hormuz has eventually been compelled to relinquish that control. The Portuguese held it longest and fell hardest. The British, who replaced direct Portuguese presence with a more subtle but equally self interested network of influence treaties and naval patrols over the following centuries, eventually withdrew from east of Suez in the 1970s as the economics and politics of empire shifted beneath them. The strategic lesson is not that military force is useless at choke points. Force clearly works in the short and medium term, sometimes impressively, sometimes for decades, sometimes even for a century or more. The lesson is that force has a shelf life at narrow places, and the geography, which does not age, does not negotiate, and does not lose interest, always outlasts the garrison. After the Portuguese departed, the strait settled into a different and quieter rhythm. Persian and Arab powers managed the corridor through a shifting combination of local governance, tribal negotiation, and the practical understanding that the passage would remain open because every party with influence depended on it remaining so. European engagement shifted from direct military occupation to commercial presence, and later to the kind of indirect imperial management that the British would refine across the Gulf over the next 3 centuries. The strait remained essential. The toll kept being collected in different currencies and under different names by different hands, but the fundamental dynamic, coastal geography, granting structural leverage to local actors over distant powers, did not change. It had not changed in 5,000 years. It was not going to change now. For nearly 3 centuries after the Portuguese left and the strait settled into a quieter rhythm, local powers, Persian and Arab, managed the corridor. European influence shifted to trade rather than occupation. And then, in 1908, something was discovered beneath the Persian ground that would multiply the strait's importance by orders of magnitude. The discovery of oil in Persia in 1908 did not immediately transform the Strait of Hormuz. For the first few decades of the petroleum age, the volumes were modest, the infrastructure primitive, ambiguous, and the global economy not yet existentially dependent on liquid hydrocarbons. Coal still powered most industry. Oil was important, but not yet supreme. The strait remained strategically significant as it had been for millennia, but its specific character had not yet undergone the radical amplification that was coming. But the trajectory was unmistakable. Each decade brought more wells, more pipelines feeding crude to coastal terminals, more tankers queuing at Gulf ports. By the middle of the 20th century, the Persian Gulf had become the most important energy basin on Earth, and the strait through which all of that energy had to pass had acquired a vastly more consequential kind of significance. The scale shift was staggering and worth pausing over because without grasping the magnitude of the change, one day nothing that follows in the story makes full sense. In the days of the Kingdom of Ormus, the most valuable cargoes passing through the strait were measured in chests, bales, and sacks. Silks, spices, pearls, copper ingots, precious stones. Valuable, certainly, worth fighting over as the Portuguese had demonstrated, but finite in volume and inherently limited in their systemic importance to the broader functioning of civilization. The loss of a single trading season or even a prolonged disruption of Gulf commerce would damage fortunes and unsettle markets across the Indian Ocean world. but it would not bring industrial economies to their knees or trigger cascading failures in global food production. Oil changed that equation entirely, and it changed it in a way that made the Strait's ancient leverage not just relevant, but potentially catastrophic. By the mid 20th century, more raw economic value passed through the Strait of Hormuz in a single average day than the medieval kingdom of Ormus had likely handled in an entire prosperous year. And the commodity in transit was no longer a luxury good or a strategic material in the limited military sense. It was the foundational fuel of industrial civilization itself. Electricity generation, mechanized transportation, large scale agriculture, chemical manufacturing, plastics production, pharmaceutical synthesis, the heating of homes and the cooling of cities, all of it ran directly or indirectly on petroleum and its derivatives. And a vast and growing share of that petroleum originated in the Gulf states, whose only route to market was the same narrow corridor that had carried copper and silk for 5,000 years. And yet, beneath this extraordinary transformation of scale and consequence, the underlying structural dynamic remained identical. The geography had not changed. The strait was still 21 nautical miles wide at its narrowest point. It was still the sole maritime exit from the Gulf into the open ocean. It still funneled all seaborne traffic through a confined corridor where the inherent advantage of the coastal defender over the distant naval power remained as stark and as structurally permanent as it had been when Ormus collected customs duties from passing dhows. Then the only thing that had truly changed was the magnitude of the consequences should the corridor be disrupted. The choke point was the same physical feature it had always been. The cargo passing through it now powered the entire modern world. The first modern demonstration of what this amplified leverage actually meant in practice came not through open war, but through politics and economic coercion. In 1951, the Iranian government under Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized the country's oil industry, seizing control of petroleum assets that had been operated and profited from by the British-controlled Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. The move was a direct challenge to decades of foreign control over Iranian resources. Britain's response was swift, forceful, and deeply revealing of the dynamics at play. Among the measures London deployed to pressure Iran into reversing the nationalization was a naval blockade of Iranian oil exports. British warships positioned themselves to intercept and turn back tankers carrying Iranian crude, effectively leveraging control of the maritime approaches to the Gulf, including the Strait and its surrounding waters, to impose an economic stranglehold on a sovereign nation. The Abadan crisis, named after the great Iranian refinery city at its center, did not ultimately escalate into sustained military conflict in the strait itself. It was resolved after considerable political turmoil and severe economic damage to Iran through a combination of international diplomatic pressure, covert intelligence operations orchestrated by British and American agencies, and the eventual overthrow of Mossadegh's government in 1953. But the crisis planted a seed in the strategic imagination of every government in the region, a seed that would germinate and grow for decades after the immediate events faded from newspaper headlines and diplomatic cables. The episode demonstrated for the first time in the petroleum age that control or threatened control of the maritime approaches to the Gulf could be wielded as a direct economic weapon against a sovereign oil-producing state. The sea lanes were not neutral highways open to all. They were instruments of power, and whoever could influence passage through them held leverage over the nations whose economies depended on their openness. And the crisis demonstrated something else, something subtler and ultimately more consequential, that every subsequent Iranian government absorbed into its strategic thinking and never forgot. Iran's position on the northern shore of the strait, commanding the mountainous coastline that overlooked the shipping lanes, was not merely a geographical detail on a nautical chart or an accident of borders. It was leverage, structural, permanent, and renewable leverage that did not require a large navy or advanced technology to exploit. It merely required the willingness to threaten and the credibility to make that threat believed. From that point forward, the dual nature of the strait became the defining feature of Gulf security. For the oil exporting states, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the UAE, Kuwait, and Iran itself, the strait was a lifeline. Their revenues, their budgets. So their social contracts all depended on uninterrupted oil exports through this corridor. For the consuming nations, initially Western Europe and the United States, and increasingly the industrial economies of Asia, the strait was a critical artery. Disruption meant not just higher prices, but potential recession and political instability. And for Iran specifically, the strait was both lifeline and artery, and something additional, it was a weapon, a card that could be played during moments of extreme pressure. The same corridor that carried Iran's own exports also carried its rivals' exports. To threaten closure was to threaten everyone, including yourself, but in a desperate crisis, that mutually assured economic destruction could function as a deterrent or a bargaining chip. By the closing decades of the 20th century, the numbers defining this dependency had swelled to proportions that would have been literally unimaginable to any previous generation. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the UAE, Kuwait, and Iran together exported the overwhelming majority of their crude through the strait. The combined daily flow approached and eventually surpassed 20 million barrels, representing roughly 1/5 of global petroleum liquids consumption and approximately 1/4 of all oil moved by sea anywhere in the world. Limited bypass capacity existed. Saudi Arabia had built the East-West pipeline, and the UAE had constructed a smaller line to the port of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman coast. Together, these alternatives could handle approximately 2.6 million barrels per day at maximum capacity, against a baseline of 20 million barrels flowing daily through the strait. That bypass represented roughly 13% of the total, meaningful in a partial disruption, utterly insufficient to compensate for a full closure. This was the architecture of dependency that the late 20th century had constructed, largely without deliberate design, and that the 21st century quietly inherited without questioning its assumptions. An entire global energy system feeding billions of people and powering the industrial and agricultural output of dozens of nations, routed through a single narrow maritime corridor barely wider than a lake. The old Ormus logic of extracting wealth from position rather than production had been amplified to a scale where the consequences of disruption were no longer local, no longer regional, but genuinely planetary. That double-edged logic, the strait as both lifeline and weapon, stayed theoretical for decades. Then, in 1980, a war broke out that would turn the theory into fire, oil, and steel. The Iran-Iraq War began in September of 1980 when Iraqi forces invaded western Iran. The causes were tangled: territorial disputes, ideological fears, and opportunistic calculations that a post-revolution Iran would be easy to defeat. Those calculations proved catastrophically wrong. Within 2 years, the war had settled into a brutal, grinding stalemate along a front line that barely moved for the remaining 6 years of conflict. And as the land war locked into its bloody equilibrium, both sides turned their strategic attention to a different battlefield: the water, the Persian Gulf, and above all, Rouge, the corridor through which both nations depended on for economic survival. What followed was the Tanker War, a sustained campaign of attacks on commercial shipping that transformed the Gulf into something the modern world had not witnessed since the submarine campaigns of the Second World War. The logic from both sides was grimly straightforward. Iraq wanted to cripple Iran's ability to fund its war effort by destroying or deterring the tankers that carried Iranian crude oil to international markets. If you could stop the oil from flowing, you could strangle the economy that kept the Iranian military supplied, equipped, and fighting. Iran, in retaliation and as part of a broader coercive strategy, attacked tankers carrying oil from Iraq's Gulf allies, particularly Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. Diti, whose enormous financial support was helping to sustain the Iraqi war machine. If Iraq could threaten Iranian shipping, Iran would threaten everyone else's. The Gulf itself became the economic pressure valve for a land war that neither side could win by force of arms alone. The numbers carry a blunt and sobering weight. Over the course of the conflict, Iraq attacked approximately 283 commercial vessels. Iran attacked 168. These were not warning shots or symbolic gestures. They were missile strikes launched from aircraft at altitude, mine detonations that tore open steel hulls from below, and direct assaults by fast attack craft on tankers whose only offense was carrying petroleum through waters that had become an active war zone. Supertankers loaded with crude were hit by Exocet missiles and burned for days, enormous columns of black smoke rising thousands of feet into the Gulf sky, visible from shore on both sides. Crews abandoned ship into oil-slicked water, some rescued by passing vessels, others left to drift in the punishing heat. Smaller tankers struck mines and broke apart with terrifying speed. The insurance industry watched its models for Gulf shipping disintegrate in real time. Premiums skyrocketed. Some underwriters refused to cover Gulf voyages at any price. Shipping companies began diverting vessels around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks of transit time and enormous costs to voyages that had previously been routine. The world's response was slow, reluctant, and then sudden. For the first several years of the tanker war, the international community largely observed from a cautious distance, unwilling to be drawn into a conflict between two regional powers that neither side appeared capable of winning or willing to end. The attacks were terrible for the crews involved and increasingly costly for the global shipping industry, but they had not yet threatened a complete and permanent disruption of Gulf oil flows. Enough tankers were still getting through the corridor. Oil prices, while volatile and sensitive to every new attack report, had not detonated in the way that the most alarming, worst-case scenarios had long predicted. But by 1987, the escalation had reached a point where the United States felt compelled to intervene directly. Kuwait, under sustained and intensifying Iranian attacks on its tanker fleet, formally requested American military protection. The result was Operation Earnest Will, a United States Navy escort mission in which Kuwaiti oil tankers were reflagged under the American flag and escorted through the Gulf and its approaches by warships of the Fifth Fleet. It was the largest naval convoy operation conducted by any nation since the Second World War. and it placed American military vessels directly and continuously in the line of fire in one of the most confined and operationally dangerous waterways on the planet. The escorts were not a simple matter of showing the flag and hoping the attacks would stop out of deference to American power. The Gulf is shallow in many places, littered with islands, oil platforms, shoals, and submerged obstructions that provide concealment for small craft and severely complicate radar and sonar surveillance. Iranian Revolutionary Guard forces operated fast attack boats from concealed bases along the coastline and on islands scattered throughout the Gulf's interior waters. And mines, the oldest, cheapest, and most indiscriminate naval weapon in existence, were laid in the shipping lanes under cover of darkness, often deployed from converted civilian vessels, wooden dhows, and small cargo boats that were nearly impossible to distinguish from legitimate fishing and commercial traffic until their deadly cargo began detonating beneath the hulls of passing ships. In April of 1988, the guided missile frigate USS Samuel B. Roberts struck an Iranian mine while on escort duty in the Central Gulf. And the explosion tore a massive hole in the ship's hull, broke the vessel's keel, and nearly sank a modern warship specifically designed and built to survive combat damage. The crew fought desperately for hours in flooded compartments to keep the frigate afloat. The damage was catastrophic, the injuries severe, and the message to every naval planner and shipping executive watching from Washington, London, and Tokyo was unmistakable. Even the most powerful navy in the world, operating with advanced sensors, dedicated minesweeping capability, and full situational awareness, could not guarantee safe passage through a mined choke point against an adversary willing to use cheap, abundant, and effectively invisible weapons. The American response to the mining of the Samuel B. Roberts came 3 days later and was the largest surface naval engagement the United States had fought since Leyte Gulf in 1944. Operation Praying Mantis was a coordinated multi-platform strike against Iranian naval and military assets across the Gulf. American warships and carrier-based aircraft attacked Iranian oil platforms that had been repurposed as military surveillance and staging bases, engaged and sank or severely disabled multiple Iranian naval vessels, including a frigate, a gunboat, and several fast attack craft, and established for a single violent and decisive day an overwhelming conventional naval superiority across the Gulf's central waters. The operation was a tactical success by any standard of conventional military assessment. The Iranian surface fleet was badly damaged. The staging platforms were reduced to twisted steel and fire. The demonstration of American precision firepower was delivered with clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. But here is the reversal that makes the tanker war so critical to understanding everything that has happened at the Strait in the decades since. Operation Praying Mantis won the battle. It did not solve the problem. The mines did not stop appearing. Iranian fast attack craft, cheap and rapidly replaceable, continued to operate from coastal positions that the strikes had not targeted. Coastal missile batteries concealed in the folds of the Zagros Mountains, overlooking the Strait's shipping lanes and approaches, were never seriously threatened by the operation and remained fully intact, fully operational, and ready to fire. And the insurance market, which had watched a modern American warship nearly founder from a single inexpensive mine, did not suddenly regain its confidence in Gulf shipping safety. The premiums stayed elevated. The risk perception stayed frozen at crisis levels. For weeks and months after Praying Mantis, the military victory and the economic reality occupied two entirely separate worlds. The U.S. Navy had proven beyond any doubt that it could destroy any Iranian warship it chose to engage in open water, and yet tankers were still striking mines. Crews were still being evacuated from burning vessels. Underwriters were still pricing the Gulf as an active war zone where the next detonation could come at any moment. The gap between winning a naval battle and actually securing a maritime corridor against cheap, persistent, bad, and asymmetric threats had been exposed for the first time in the modern era, and that gap was enormous. The tanker war wound down with the broader Iran-Iraq ceasefire in August of 1988. The shooting stopped. The mines were slowly and painstakingly cleared from the shipping lanes over the following months and years. A dangerous and tedious process that claimed additional lives and resources long after the formal hostilities had ended. Insurance premiums gradually receded toward peacetime levels as the minesweeping progressed and months passed without new incidents. Commercial traffic returned to its normal rhythms and volumes, and the world, with the characteristically short memory that the Strait's history keeps punishing across the centuries, filed the episode away and moved on to other concerns. But Iran did not move on. Iran drew a very different lesson from the tanker war than the one that Western analysts took comfort in. The Western narrative focused on praying mantis as a decisive demonstration of American naval dominance. The Pentagon's lesson was reassuring. Conventional superiority could be brought to bear quickly and overwhelmingly in the Gulf when circumstances demanded it. That narrative was comforting and, in a narrow tactical sense, entirely accurate, but it missed what Iran had actually learned. Iran had learned that you did not need to match the United States Navy ship for ship or weapon system for weapon system to create real and lasting strategic leverage in the Strait and its approaches. You needed only to make the corridor dangerous enough, unpredictable enough, and psychologically threatening enough that the economic machinery of global shipping began to seize up on its own. Mines were cheap. Fast attack boats were expendable. Coastal missiles could be hidden, moved, and hidden again. And the real target was never the warships. The real target was confidence. The confidence of ship owners, of insurance syndicates, of the individual captains who had to decide each morning whether to take their vessels and their crews through a corridor where the next explosion could come from beneath the waterline at any moment without the slightest warning. That lesson would shape everything Iran built and refined over the next 30 years. A layered, distributed, asymmetric, denial-focused military capability designed not to defeat the American fleet in any conventional engagement, but to make the Strait of Hormuz too costly, too unpredictable, and too frightening for the global shipping industry to use with any confidence. The 1980s had been the rough and costly rehearsal. What came next was the refined and perfected version. After 1988, Iran drew a different lesson from the tanker war than the rest of the world did. The world saw American naval dominance proven. Iran saw something else entirely, a blueprint for how to threaten the Strait without ever needing to match the U.S. Navy ship for ship. In the decades following the tanker war, while the world's strategic attention drifted to other crises and other regions, Iran quietly and methodically built something that most Western analysts initially failed to recognize for what it truly was. Not a conventional navy designed to challenge American aircraft carriers in open water. That would have been suicidally expensive and strategically pointless against a fleet no nation on earth could match. Instead, Iran constructed a layered and tightly interlocking system of asymmetric capabilities. each individually modest in cost, but collectively designed to achieve a single devastating objective: not to close the Strait of Hormuz by physically sinking every ship that attempted to enter it. That would require a military capacity Iran does not possess and would trigger a retaliatory response that would destroy what remains of its naval infrastructure within days. Instead, the objective was subtler, more elegant, and far more difficult to counter: to make transiting the strait so dangerous, so uncertain, and so prohibitively costly that the global shipping industry would effectively close it on Iran's behalf. This distinction between physical closure and economic closure is the hidden mechanism at the heart of every Hormuz crisis since the tanker war. And understanding it changes everything about how you interpret the strait's power, its vulnerability, and the real nature of the threat it poses to the modern world. Start with what Iran assembled: sea mines, thousands of them stockpiled according to Western intelligence assessments, ranging from crude contact mines, whose basic design has changed little since the First World War, more sophisticated influence mines that detonate when they detect the magnetic, acoustic, or pressure signature of a passing vessel. Mines are extraordinarily cheap to produce. They can be manufactured domestically with relatively basic industrial tooling. They can be deployed from almost any platform afloat: a naval vessel, a commercial barge, a wooden fishing dhow, under cover of darkness in quantities that make comprehensive detection and clearance an agonizingly slow and dangerous process. A single naval mine costs a few $1,000s to build and deploy. Finding it, identifying it, and neutralizing it safely costs hundreds of thousands. And until every mine in a given corridor has been accounted for, every ship that transits that corridor is gambling with its hull, its cargo, and its crew. Then fast attack craft: small, nimble, high-speed boats armed with rockets, torpedoes, and in some configurations, ship-killing anti-ship missiles operated by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy rather than the regular Iranian fleet. These are not blue water warships designed for sustained engagements. They are expendable weapons platforms built for hit-and-run swarming attacks in confined and cluttered waters. They launch from concealed positions along Iran's coastline and from island bases across the Gulf. Attack in coordinated groups designed to overwhelm a defender's ability to track and engage multiple simultaneous threats and withdraw before a conventional warship can bring its superior firepower to bear. In the open ocean, they would be easy targets. In the narrow, shallow, island-studded waters near the strait, they are a persistent and genuine menace that cannot be eliminated without occupying the coastline itself. Then, coastal anti-ship cruise missiles. Iran has invested heavily in mobile shore-based missile systems that can be hidden in the Zagros mountain terrain, overlooking the strait, and repositioned frequently to avoid satellite detection and preemptive strikes. These systems can reach any vessel transiting the shipping lanes from launch positions that are effectively invisible until the moment of firing and that can be vacated within minutes of launch. Then drones, unmanned aerial vehicles for surveillance and increasingly for precision strike, extending Iran's ability to monitor and attack specific vessels across the entire Gulf and beyond. And midget submarines, small enough to operate in the strait's shallow and acoustically complex waters, nearly undetectable by conventional anti-submarine warfare methods, capable of laying mines or launching torpedoes in the confined shipping lanes. None of these systems, individually or collectively, can defeat the United States Fifth Fleet in a conventional naval engagement. That was never their purpose. Their purpose is layered and cumulative. Together, they create what military strategists call an anti access and area denial environment, a zone in which entering and operating becomes so dangerous and so uncertain that rational economic actors choose to avoid it entirely or accept it only at costs that fundamentally alter the commercial calculus of global shipping. And the critical insight, the one that transforms this from a purely military problem into something far more subtle and far more strategically potent, is that the ultimate target of this entire system is not a warship and not even a tanker. The ultimate target is a spreadsheet. This is how maritime insurance works, stripped to its essence. Every commercial vessel operating in international waters carries hull and cargo insurance. Without it, the ship cannot legally put to sea, cannot enter most ports, and cannot secure the contracts that make commercial voyages financially viable. When a vessel transits a zone that the insurance industry has designated as elevated risk, a war risk area, an additional premium is charged on top of standard coverage. That premium reflects the underwriter's assessment of the probability that the vessel will be damaged, detained, or destroyed during the transit. In peacetime, the war risk premium for the Strait of Hormuz is modest, a routine cost absorbed without difficulty by the shipping companies that move Gulf oil to market. But when incidents occur, when mines are suspected in the shipping lanes, when a tanker is seized by armed boarding parties, when a drone detonates against a vessel's superstructure, the premium spikes. Sometimes it doubles overnight. Sometimes it increases by a factor of 5 or 10. And in acute crises, coverage can become effectively unavailable at any price because the actuarial risk exceeds what any insurer is willing or legally permitted to underwrite. When the premium reaches a certain threshold, a cascade begins that no navy can stop. Shipping companies operating on tight margins begin to delay or cancel Gulf transits rather than absorb the inflated insurance costs. Tanker availability tightens as vessels are rerouted to longer alternative passages. Oil scheduled for loading at Gulf terminals remains in storage. Spot prices rise not because supply has been physically destroyed, but because the logistical machinery that connects Gulf wellheads to Asian and European refineries has been disrupted at its most vulnerable point. And here is the mechanism that makes this form of warfare so effective and so profoundly difficult to counter with conventional military tools. A navy can sweep a minefield given enough time, enough minesweepers, and enough tolerance for the risk that some mines will be missed. A naval escort can protect individual convoys on individual transits. An airstrike can destroy a known missile battery or sink an identified attack craft. But the insurance market does not operate on a military timetable and does not take its cues from tactical victories. Confidence, once broken by a pattern of attacks and demonstrated capability, rebuilds slowly, cautiously, and on its own terms. Even after mines are cleared and missile launchers are struck, underwriters examine the pattern of repeated incidents, the demonstrated capability and willingness of the adversary to attack again, and they keep the premiums elevated until they are satisfied that the risk has genuinely and durably declined. The strait can be physically open with minesweepers on station and warships patrolling every mile and still be economically shut because no insurer will write an affordable policy for a tanker to transit it. This is the invisible war, the war that never appears on tactical maps or in military briefings. The war fought not with ordnance, but with risk models, actuarial projections, and the quiet calculations of insurance syndicates in London, Tokyo, and Oslo, who determine, with the adjustment of a percentage on a policy document, whether the Strait of Hormuz functions as a commercial corridor or does not. Insurance syndicates, not navies, ultimately decide whether the strait works. A destroyer can guarantee safe passage for a single convoy on a single day through a single stretch of water. It cannot guarantee that the next 10,000 commercial transits will be insured at a price that makes them commercially viable. And it is that commercial guarantee, not the military one, that sustains the daily flow of 20 million barrels of oil through the corridor. Iran's weakest conventional navy in the region has, through this exact logic, constructed what may be the most effective maritime denial strategy in modern military history. Not by building aircraft carriers or acquiring nuclear submarines, not by matching American technological sophistication dollar for dollar, but by investing in cheap, abundant, replaceable, and psychologically potent tools whose function is not to sink fleets, but to shatter the confidence of the global insurance market in the safety of a single 39-kilometer corridor. That invisible strategy, attacking confidence rather than ships, stayed mostly theoretical through the 2000s and early 2010s. Then, in the summer of 2019, someone decided to test it. And in June of 2019, 2 commercial tankers were attacked in the Gulf of Oman, just outside the eastern approaches to the Strait of Hormuz. The method was precise and carefully calibrated. Limpet mines, small explosive devices designed to be attached magnetically to the hull of a vessel at the waterline, were detonated in broad daylight against the sides of the 2 ships. The damage was significant, but deliberately not catastrophic. The vessels were holed and fires broke out, but neither ship sank. Crews were evacuated safely. No one died, and that restraint, that meticulous calibration of violence, was itself a message as deliberate as the charges that delivered it. The United States blamed Iran. Tehran denied involvement. The evidence presented included surveillance footage appearing to show an Iranian Revolutionary Guard vessel removing an unexploded limpet mine from one of the damaged tankers, presumably to eliminate forensic evidence. The footage was disputed by some analysts and rejected by Tehran, but the ambiguity was the strategic point. The attacks were dramatic enough to dominate headlines and signal the shipping industry about the vulnerability of vessels near the strait. They were deniable enough to prevent the kind of unambiguous attribution that would compel a direct military response. This was not a declaration of war. It was a demonstration, a proof of concept for the strategy Iran had been refining since the tanker war. The insurance market responded exactly as the architecture of asymmetric denial predicted it would. And war risk premiums for vessels transiting the Gulf of Oman and the Straits approaches spiked immediately and dramatically. Some underwriters imposed emergency surcharges that multiplied the cost of a single transit several 100% within 48 hours. Shipping companies recalculated their routes, their financial exposure, and their willingness to operate in what had suddenly become a visibly contested waterway. The attacks had not closed the strait. Commercial traffic continued. Oil still flowed from Gulf terminals to Asian and European refineries. But the cost of that continued flow had just increased sharply and measurably, and the precedent had been set for the world to absorb. The theory could be converted into practice at a time and place of the attacker's choosing. What followed over the next several years was not a single dramatic escalation, but a pattern of accumulating incidents that functioned less like a conventional military campaign and more like a slow, methodical, deliberate tightening of a screw against the global shipping industry's tolerance for risk. Each turn of that screw raised the baseline of risk perception a little higher, tested the limits of international tolerance a little further, and demonstrated with growing clarity that the asymmetric tools actually worked in practice. In 2021, a drone struck a tanker linked to Israeli business interests in the Gulf of Oman. This time, crew members were killed. The attack crossed a threshold that the 2019 incidents had deliberately avoided. We're introducing lethal force into a pattern that had previously been calibrated to damage property without taking lives. And the weapon itself marked an evolution with its own strategic implications. Drones, cheaper than manned aircraft, more precise than unguided munitions, and harder to attribute than a missile fired from a known coastal battery, were proving capable of reaching and striking specific vessels in open water well beyond the physical confines of the strait itself. The threat zone was expanding outward. The geography of danger was no longer confined to the 21 nautical mile wide corridor between Iran and Oman. It now encompassed the broader Gulf of Oman and parts of the Arabian Sea approaches. Then came the seizures. Iranian Revolutionary Guard forces began intercepting and detaining foreign flagged commercial vessels transiting near Iranian waters. The pretexts varied: alleged sanctions violations, smuggling accusations, legal claims, but the pattern was consistent. A vessel would be surrounded by armed fast attack craft, boarded and escorted to an Iranian port, where it and its crew would be held for weeks or months while negotiations played out at Tehran's pace. The crews were generally not harmed, but the message to the global shipping industry was unambiguous. Your vessel, your cargo, and your people can be taken at any time. The cost of that risk is yours to calculate. Each of these incidents individually fell below the threshold that would trigger a decisive military response. No single attack constituted an unambiguous act of war. No single seizure justified the deployment of a battle group. That calibration was the design. The strategy operated in the gray zone between peace and war, accumulating pressure without providing the provocation that would unite the international community in a decisive response. Each incident was a data point. Each data point nudged the insurance dial upward. Each premium adjustment reminded the world that the strait was not a permanently open highway, but an active risk environment that could worsen at any moment. By 2024 and into the early months of 2025, daily oil flows through the strait still averaged approximately 20 to 20.9 million barrels per day. On paper, the corridor was functioning. The tankers kept coming and departing on schedule. Global oil markets, while nervous and periodically volatile in response to individual incidents, had not experienced the kind of systemic disruption that the most alarming models predicted. But beneath that surface of continued operation, the system was running at the outermost edge of its tolerances, and everyone who monitored the corridor closely understood how thin the margin had become. Insurance premiums for Gulf transits were persistently elevated above their historical peacetime norms, a quiet and invisible tax on global energy that consumers never saw on their fuel receipts but paid through every product and service that depended on Gulf oil reaching its destination. The physical infrastructure for a full-scale disruption, mines stockpiled and pre-positioned, coastal missile batteries tested and dispersed along the Zagros shoreline, drone systems proven in live operational conditions, fast attack craft exercised in coordinated swarming formations was visibly and demonstrably in place. The international naval presence led by the U.S. Fifth Fleet from its permanent headquarters in Bahrain maintained constant patrols and surveillance of the corridor. But the patrols could observe the strait. They could escort individual convoys. They could not, as 3 decades of accumulated evidence from the tanker war through the 2019 attacks and beyond had conclusively demonstrated, guarantee the corridor's safety against a determined adversary operating from its own coastline with weapons designed specifically to exploit the gap between military victory and commercial confidence. The strait, in those final months before what came next, existed in a state of taut and precarious equilibrium that anyone watching closely could feel straining at its limits. A loaded spring held in compression by a single thin wire of mutual deterrence and shared economic self-interest. Iran needed the strait open for its own oil exports and for the food and manufactured goods that its population imported through the same corridor. The consuming world needed it open for everything else. The wire held because both calculations, Iranian and international, still pointed narrowly toward restraint. Neither side wanted the catastrophic economic consequences of a full closure. Neither side was willing to be the party that broke the system. But the spring was fully compressed. The asymmetric tools were tested, deployed, and positioned along the coastline. The strategy had been validated across 3 decades of incremental probing and gradual escalation, each cycle demonstrating that the costs of disruption fell disproportionately on the consuming nations, while the tools of disruption remained cheap, replaceable, and deniable. And everyone who studied the corridor professionally, the naval planners in Washington and Bahrain, the insurance actuaries recalculating their models in London and Singapore, the energy security analysts briefing governments in Beijing, New Delhi, Tokyo, and Seoul, understood with quiet and growing certainty that the wire holding everything in place was not unbreakable, that a sufficiently severe geopolitical shock, a direct military confrontation between Iran and the United States or Israel, or a catastrophic breakdown of the diplomatic channels that had managed previous crises, an escalation spiral that outpaced the ability of any party to arrest it, could snap that thin wire and release the accumulated tension of the spring in a matter of hours rather than months. For years, the spring held. Traffic continued. Oil flowed. The world treated the strait as a manageable risk. Then, in early 2026, the conditions changed and the spring released. The crisis did not arrive gradually. It arrived in the form of a public declaration from Tehran in early 2026, issued against the backdrop of escalating military operations between the United States, Israel, and Iran that had pushed the region to a breaking point that diplomats and analysts had been warning about for months without being able to prevent. The specific wording of the Iranian announcement was unambiguous in a way that previous threats had never quite been. Any vessel attempting to transit the Strait of Hormuz would be attacked. Not merely Israeli-linked shipping, not merely tankers bound for hostile ports, not merely vessels flagged in nations Tehran considered adversarial. Any vessel from any flag state carrying any cargo. The corridor was closed, effective immediately, and enforcement would be delivered by whatever means Tehran judged necessary. And this time, the declaration was not a diplomatic bluff or a rhetorical flourish delivered for domestic consumption. The tools that Iran had spent 3 decades building, testing, refining, and positioning were activated in sequence within hours. Sea mines, under pre-positioned and deployed from small craft operating along the Iranian coastline, appeared in the shipping lanes. Coastal anti-ship missile batteries concealed in the mountain folds of the Zagros that overlooked the corridor came to operational readiness. Fast attack craft swarmed out of hidden coves and island bases, patrolling the approaches with visible hostility. Drones circled overhead, surveilling every vessel still in the corridor and broadcasting their presence to the international maritime community. The message was not merely delivered in words, it was delivered in steel and explosive, and the menacing choreography of a coastline transformed into a weapon. The effect was immediate, visible, and catastrophic on a scale that even the worst-case models had predicted only in abstract percentages rather than in the real-time collapse of an actual commercial system. Shipping did not slow. It did not gradually taper. It stopped almost as if a switch had been flipped somewhere in the invisible machinery of global commerce. AIS tracking data, the automatic identification signals that all commercial vessels are required to broadcast, showed daily transit numbers plummeting from the historical baseline of approximately 153 vessels per day to roughly 13. Not 13% of the previous volume, 13 vessels. A 92% reduction in commercial traffic through a corridor that, only days earlier, had been carrying a fifth of the world's oil. Oil flows that had averaged 20 million barrels per day collapsed to a trickle within 48 hours of the declaration. Tankers queued up at Gulf loading ports that suddenly had nowhere to send their cargoes, holding patterns forming in waters that days earlier had been bustling with departures. Other tankers, mid-voyage and approaching the strait from the Arabian Sea, turned around or dropped anchor in safer waters off the Omani coast and waited for clarity that did not come. Loaded supertankers bound for refineries in China, India, Japan, and South Korea sat motionless at sea while their captains consulted intense radio calls with ship owners, with insurance underwriters, with maritime lawyers, and with national authorities who themselves had no clear guidance to offer. Decisions that normally took hours were stretched into days. Decisions that normally took days could not be made at all because the conditions for making them no longer existed. And then the insurance market did what the insurance market had always ultimately had the power to do. It did not simply raise premiums to punitive levels. It withdrew coverage entirely. Lloyd's of London and the major war risk underwriters formally designated the Strait of Hormuz and its approaches as an active war zone. Once that designation was in place, the actuarial calculation became effectively impossible. No underwriter was willing to price the risk of a vessel transiting a corridor where mines had been confirmed, where missile batteries were actively tracking surface traffic, and where any ship could be struck at any moment without warning and without warning's legal preconditions. Coverage was not expensive. Coverage was unavailable at any price that any commercial operator could absorb. Without insurance, commercial vessels cannot legally put to sea. This is not a matter of preference or prudence. It is a hard regulatory, contractual, and financial constraint built into every level of the global shipping system. Port authorities will not accept uninsured ships. Cargo contracts cannot be honored without valid policies. Banks will not finance uninsured voyages. Flag states will not certify uninsured vessels for international operation. The insurance market's withdrawal from Hormuz was, in effect, a legal and commercial closure of the corridor that was enforced not by warships but by policy documents and the quiet refusal of underwriters to expose their syndicates to unacceptable loss. The ripple effects began within hours of the collapse and intensified through the days that followed. Oil prices spiked on international markets, not merely by the double-digit percentages that previous crises had produced, but by magnitudes that triggered emergency responses from central banks and strategic reserves. The spike was not caused by physical destruction of supply, right? Not a single Gulf oil field had been touched. The crude was still there in the ground and still flowing to the terminals. The price detonation came entirely from the sudden severance of the logistical chain that connected those terminals to the refineries and markets that had been waiting for the next shipment. Supply and demand had not changed in any fundamental sense. The ability to physically move the supply from producer to consumer had simply stopped. Liquefied natural gas supplies from Qatar, which had also been exiting the Gulf through the same corridor, were caught in the same paralysis with no separate exit and no alternative route. European and Asian nations that depended on Qatari LNG for winter heating and industrial power generation watched their planned deliveries vanish from the schedule one by one as tankers failed to depart and arrival dates slipped from the books. And in a development that few outside the specialized energy and agricultural press had anticipated or properly modeled, the fertilizer supply chain began to fracture along the same fault line. Ammonia and urea shipments from Gulf producers to farming regions in South and East Asia stopped moving at the source. The chemical foundation of global agriculture, the invisible input that allowed the fields of India and China and a dozen other nations to feed their enormous populations, was suddenly and unexpectedly disrupted at its origin point. The consequences of that disruption would not show up immediately on any visible market chart. They would appear months later in the next planting cycle, in the yields of the next harvest, in the quiet arithmetic of calories available per person that determines whether food prices rise gently or whether riots begin in cities that have not seen them in a generation. 80% of the oil that had been flowing through the strait before the crisis had been heading to Asia. China, India, Japan, and South Korea, the four largest Asian consumers, found their energy lifelines severed simultaneously and without meaningful warning. This was not a distant Middle Eastern concern. This was the industrial foundation of East and South Asian economic life being switched off at the source. The bypass pipelines that had long been cited as the fallback option, Saudi Arabia's east-west line to the Red Sea port of Yanbu, and the UAE's smaller line to Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman coast, activated immediately to their maximum capacity. Combined at full throughput, they could reroute approximately 2.6 million barrels per day against the 20 million barrel shortfall left by the strait's closure. That capacity was a rounding error, meaningful in the sense that any barrel matters in a crisis, but nowhere close to replacing the flow that had been lost. The math was unforgiving. 13% is not a solution. It is a small consolation. And here, much in the opening days and weeks of the crisis, every thesis that 3 decades of careful analysis had produced about the strait was proven simultaneously and in real time. The strait's power was geographical, not political, exactly as the historical record had always suggested. A sovereign coastal actor with modest resources could halt global commerce through the corridor simply by making transit sufficiently dangerous. Insurance determined function more decisively than any navy, exactly as the asymmetric strategy had always predicted. The withdrawal of coverage achieved what no physical blockade could have achieved without open warfare. Bypass alternatives were inadequate at a scale of magnitude, not merely at a scale of percentage, exactly as the capacity figures had always warned, and selective enforcement, under the combination of mines and missiles and drones targeting the corridor rather than a declared total blockade, was sufficient to achieve economic closure without requiring the physical impossibility of sinking every ship in the Gulf. But the most unsettling revelation of the crisis did not arrive with the initial shock. It arrived in the weeks that followed, as military operations intensified and as minesweeping began cautiously in the cleared zones. Because even as the physical threats were reduced, even as individual mines were located and neutralized, even as coastal missile batteries were struck from the air, the insurance market's confidence did not return. Underwriters looked at the historical pattern, at the demonstrated willingness of Iran to attack, at the distributed and resilient nature of the asymmetric capabilities that could not be fully eliminated from the air or from a single military operation, and they kept the war risk designation in place. Premiums remained effectively unavailable. Coverage remained effectively withdrawn. The strait could be open in a strictly military sense, with minesweepers on station and patrols active in the cleared lanes, and simultaneously closed in a commercial sense because no insurer was willing to underwrite the next 10,000 transits on the basis of evidence drawn from the past few weeks. The gap between physical clearance and commercial reopening became the defining feature of the crisis. Naval operations could restore physical passage in days or weeks. Insurance market confidence, once shattered by a full-scale activation of the denial strategy, would take months to rebuild and might never fully return to its previous baseline. For the consuming nations watching their energy supplies remain frozen, even as the headlines announced military successes, the lesson was devastating. A battle won was not a strait reopened. A missile battery destroyed was not a premium restored. The commercial system had its own timeline, its own psychology, and its own irreducible caution, and none of those things could be accelerated by naval firepower, no matter how decisively it was applied. In the weeks that immediately followed, governments and analysts scrambled for alternatives. Pipelines, reroutes, strategic reserves, diplomatic openings, emergency coordination among consuming nations. The search was frantic, and the answers it returned were devastating. The first alternative that every government reached for in the opening days of the crisis was the one that had been sitting on the shelf for decades as the designated insurance policy against exactly this scenario. Bypass pipelines. Saudi Arabia's east-west pipeline, known as Petrolane, runs from the Gulf Coast terminals across the Arabian Peninsula to the Red Sea port of Yanbu, allowing Saudi crude to reach international markets without ever passing through the Strait of Hormuz. The United Arab Emirates operates a smaller line from its onshore fields to the port of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman coast, similarly bypassing the strait. Both pipelines exist. Both were designed specifically for this kind of emergency. Both were activated to maximum capacity within hours of the Iranian declaration. The combined throughput at absolute maximum sustained operation is approximately 2.6 million barrels per day. The baseline flow through the strait before the crisis had been 20 million barrels per day. The math takes a moment to absorb fully. The pipelines, at their absolute theoretical ceiling, could replace roughly 13% of the lost volume. 87% of the flow had no alternative route. There was no additional bypass capacity sitting in reserve waiting to be switched on. There was no secondary pipeline system that could be rapidly scaled up to handle the missing 17 million barrels. The infrastructure that had been marketed for decades as the fallback option turned out to be a fallback for a small fraction of the problem. And even the 2.6 million barrels of bypass capacity came with operational caveats. Maximum capacity is a theoretical figure that assumes optimal conditions, full pumping stations, no maintenance interruptions, no disruptions at the destination ports. Sustained operation at that ceiling is rarely achieved in practice. Real-world throughput during the crisis was somewhat lower than the theoretical maximum, narrowing what was already an exceedingly narrow gap. The second alternative, invoked with understandable frequency in the first week of the crisis, was the United States Navy. The Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Bahrain, represents the most concentrated deployment of naval power in the Gulf region. Its carrier strike groups, guided missile destroyers, and specialized minesweeping assets had been positioned precisely to respond to exactly this kind of contingency. Conventional wisdom held that American naval superiority could reopen the strait through a combination of airstrikes against Iranian missile batteries, surface operations against fast attack craft, and systematic minesweeping of the shipping lanes. The conventional wisdom was not wrong exactly. It was simply incomplete in a way that proved devastating. Operation Praying Mantis in 1988 had already established the historical precedent and its uncomfortable lesson. The United States could win any naval engagement it chose to fight in the Gulf. It could destroy Iranian surface vessels, sink fast attack craft, and suppress identified missile sites. What it could not do, what no navy in the world could do, was accelerate the clearance of a minefield laid in confined waters by an adversary operating from its own coastline with a virtually unlimited supply of additional mines. Minesweeping in the strait is a slow, dangerous, and methodical process. Every suspected mine must be located, identified, and neutralized individually. The work proceeds in square meters per hour, not in nautical miles per day. And while the sweeping proceeds, additional mines can be relayed from small craft operating from coves and harbors that cannot all be simultaneously surveilled. Modern weapons had only widened the gap between winning a battle and reopening a strait. Drones, cheap and abundant, could be launched from hundreds of dispersed positions along the Iranian coastline, making comprehensive suppression effectively impossible. Mobile coastal missile launchers could be relocated between strikes, surviving even sustained air campaigns by the simple expedient of never staying in one place long enough to be found. Swarm tactics using small, fast boats could saturate defensive systems in ways that even the most advanced anti-ship capabilities struggled to counter cleanly. The Fifth Fleet could and did inflict serious damage on Iran's assets during the crisis. What it could not deliver, and never had been able to deliver, was the one thing the world actually needed: a guarantee of predictable, insurable, commercially viable transit through the corridor on a timeline the global economy could survive. The third alternative, less frequently discussed but quietly activated in capitals from Washington to Tokyo to Berlin, was the coordinated release of strategic petroleum reserves. The United States, the member states of the International Energy Agency, and several individual Asian consuming nations maintain emergency stockpiles of crude oil specifically to buffer supply disruptions. The combined volume of these reserves is substantial, measured in hundreds of millions of barrels, and the reserves performed exactly the function they had been designed to perform. They bought time. They softened the immediate price spike. They provided continuity for refineries that would otherwise have run out of feedstock within days. But strategic reserves are a buffer, not a solution. The math is brutally clear. Global oil consumption runs at roughly 100 million barrels per day. The Strait had been carrying 20 million of those barrels. Even if every reserve in the world were released simultaneously at maximum flow rates, the combined release could compensate for the lost volume for a matter of weeks, not months. And the reserves are not inexhaustible. Once drawn down, they must eventually be refilled, which means buying oil back from the same strained market that the release was meant to stabilize. The fourth alternative, the one that has been cited for years by analysts, hoping that history's pattern might finally be broken, is the ongoing energy transition. Declining global demand for oil, the argument runs, will eventually neutralize the Strait's leverage. Renewable energy, electric vehicles, efficiency gains, and the long, slow decarbonization of the industrial economy will reduce the volumes that need to pass through the corridor. All right, until one day, the choke point simply matters less. The argument is not wrong in the long run. The transition is real. Volumes through the Strait may well decline over the coming decades as consuming economies diversify their energy sources. But the timelines do not match. Transition happens over decades. Crises happen in days. The 2024 and early 2025 transit volumes had remained stable at 20 to 20.9 million barrels per day, essentially unchanged from a decade earlier. Whatever the transition was doing in aggregate, it had not meaningfully reduced the Strait's acute importance to the present moment. The alternative that might eventually matter was of no use at all in the crisis that had already arrived. The future decarbonized economy was a promise. The present collapse was a fact. Taken together, the alternatives presented a picture that was devastating in its completeness. Pipelines could replace 13%. Naval force could win battles but not restore insurance markets. Strategic reserves could buy weeks. Energy transition could help a decade from now. Each option was real, each option was inadequate, and the cumulative inadequacy was not a failure of planning or imagination. It was a structural feature of the system that the late 20th century had built. The dependency on the Strait of Hormuz had been constructed without meaningful redundancy because the costs of redundancy at the required scale had always been judged too high to justify against a risk that had always, until now, been considered manageable. The absence of alternatives raised a deeper question that governments and analysts had spent decades avoiding. If the entire global energy system depends on a single corridor, and that corridor can be disrupted by a single coastal actor using weapons that cost a fraction of the systems deployed to defend it, then who is actually vulnerable in this arrangement? And who has quietly understood that vulnerability all along? The answer to that question had been hiding in plain sight for at least 20 years, visible in trade data that anyone could pull from public sources, but almost never assembled into the picture that the crisis suddenly forced into view. Of the roughly 20 million barrels per day that had been flowing through the Strait of Hormuz before the collapse, approximately 80% had been heading to a single region, Asia, specifically to the four largest Asian oil consumers whose combined populations exceed 3 billion people and whose combined economic output represents a substantial share of global GDP. China, the world's largest oil importer by volume, and a nation whose entire economic model rests on uninterrupted energy access, had been receiving a substantial portion of its imported crude from Gulf producers via the Strait, much of it under long-term contracts with Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, and Kuwait. India, the third largest importer globally and the fastest growing major consumer, was in a similar position. Its sprawling refinery complexes along the western coast, dependent on tankers that threaded the corridor to reach their destinations. Japan, which has minimal domestic energy resources and which has staked its post war industrial identity on reliable access to imported oil from the Gulf, received essentially all of its Middle Eastern crude through the same route. South Korea, whose enormous petrochemical and manufacturing industries form the backbone of its export economy, and whose major refineries cluster along the southern coast, sat in the identical situation, dependent on Gulf flows that arrived through the strait and through no other meaningful path. 4 nations, 3 billion people taken together, the combined industrial foundation of contemporary East and South Asia, all of them dependent on a 39-kilometer corridor that none of them controlled, that none of them had any meaningful unilateral means to secure, and that none of them had ever been invited to defend or to manage as a matter of shared international responsibility. This is the asymmetry the crisis exposed with devastating clarity. The strait was not an equal opportunity vulnerability for the global economy. The consequences of its disruption did not fall evenly across nations or regions. They fell first, hardest, and longest on Asia. European and American consumers experienced the crisis as rising prices at the pump and anxious headlines about supply chains. Asian consumers experienced it as an immediate threat to the industrial and agricultural foundations of their daily economic life. The difference was not merely one of degree, it was a difference of kind, and yet, Arabi, the entire security architecture that had been built up over decades to protect the strait and the broader Gulf energy system had been designed primarily by and for Western interests in a previous era of global energy demand. The United States Fifth Fleet, the permanent forward deployed naval presence that patrolled the Gulf and its approaches, had been established during the Cold War to protect Allied oil supplies and to contain Soviet and later Iranian influence in the region, the diplomatic relationships with the Gulf monarchies, the basing agreements with Bahrain and Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, the arms sales and the training programs, and the intelligence sharing partnerships that had shaped regional militaries for half a century. All of it had been constructed within a framework where the primary consuming nations were Western and the primary security providers were Western. The architecture had made sense and had functioned reasonably well in the era when the world's largest oil consumers were located in North America and Western Europe. By the early 2020s, that geographic alignment was no longer accurate, and the security architecture had not caught up to the new geography of consumption. The protection was being delivered for one set of customers, while a different and larger set of customers was paying the bill in dependency without the corresponding influence over how the corridor was managed. Asian consuming nations, for their part, had been quietly riding for decades on American naval protection of a corridor they depended on far more than the United States itself did by that point in history. This arrangement was comfortable for everyone as long as it held. Asia got reliable oil flows without the costs of maintaining its own Gulf security presence. The United States got to exercise strategic leverage over allied economies that depended on its naval umbrella. The Gulf monarchies got security guarantees that allowed them to focus on economic diversification and domestic stability. The arrangement had the quiet brittleness of all comfortable arrangements that depend on an unquestioned assumption. And the unquestioned assumption was that the strait would continue to function because the cost of disrupting it was obviously too high for anyone to rationally bear. The crisis proved the assumption wrong, and in proving it wrong, it exposed the deeper implication that had always been present in the arrangement but had rarely been stated plainly. Iran's ability to threaten the Strait of Hormuz was, in effect, a veto over Asian industrial output, not a veto that Iran could cast lightly or that it could cast without enormous cost to itself, but a veto nonetheless. A power held by a single coastal actor sitting on the northern shore of a single narrow waterway to interrupt the energy foundation of the largest manufacturing economies on Earth. That veto had existed for decades, implicit in the geography and the dependency. The 2026 crisis simply made it visible for the first time in a way that could not be ignored or minimized or explained away. For listeners watching the crisis unfold from anywhere in the world, the implication was not abstract or remote. If you lived in a country connected in any way to Asian manufacturing supply chains, which in practice meant nearly everyone on the planet, the products you depended on every day, the electronics, the vehicles, the pharmaceuticals, the clothing, the machinery, traveled through industrial systems whose energy foundation had just been demonstrated to rest on a corridor that could be closed in a matter of hours by decisions made in Tehran. The vulnerability was not theoretical, not localized, and not confined to a region far from daily life. It was distributed through the invisible architecture of modern commerce, was present in every product that had been assembled in a factory powered by Gulf oil, or synthesized from Gulf petrochemicals, or fertilized by Gulf-derived ammonia. Standing back from the numbers, from the pipeline capacities and the insurance premiums and the AIS tracking data and the increasingly urgent diplomatic cables, a larger pattern began to become visible that was older and more unsettling than any single crisis. A pattern that had been present in the Strait's history for far longer than oil had existed as a commodity. A pattern that had nothing to do with the specific ideologies of specific governments or the specific weapons of specific eras. It was a pattern about geography, power, and the quiet permanence of certain physical corridors. And once you saw it clearly, the 2026 crisis stopped looking like a unique event and started looking like the latest chapter in a story that was much, much older than anyone had been treating it as being. The pattern begins, as far as the written record allows us to trace it, around 2,600 years before the Common Era. Sumerian scribes pressing wedge-shaped marks into soft clay to record the arrival of copper from Magan and teak from the Indus Valley. Coastal villages at the mouth of the Gulf, collecting informal tolls from passing vessels. The earliest documented expression of a dynamic that has repeated in every subsequent era of the Strait's long history. A narrow maritime corridor, an indispensable flow of goods, and local actors, often modest in size and military capacity, extracting wealth and leverage from the simple fact that they sit where the traffic had no choice but to pass. From those Sumerian tablets to the kingdom of Hormuz in its medieval splendor, collecting customs from half the known world on a barren island that produced almost nothing of its own. From Hormuz to the Portuguese fortress that held the strait by force of cannon for 115 years before falling to a Safavid English alliance that wanted the same corridor for its own reasons. From the Portuguese to the British blockade of Abadan in 1951, leveraging naval control of the Strait's approaches to coerce a sovereign oil-producing nation. from Abadan to the tanker war of the 1980s. Ah, when Iraqi and Iranian forces turned the Gulf into a shooting gallery that reshaped maritime insurance for a generation, from the tanker war to the limpet mines of 2019 and the drone strikes and seizures that followed through the early 2020s, and finally to the collapse of 2026, when the asymmetric denial strategy that had been building for 40 years was activated in full and the corridor shut within hours. Every generation of strategists and statesmen believed, while their particular technology was ascendant, that their weapons had finally solved the ancient problem of the choke point. The Portuguese believed that shipborne cannon had made distant maritime control sustainable. The British believed that their global naval reach had made Gulf security routine. The 20th century Americans believed that carrier battle groups and precision munitions had put permanent physical closure beyond the reach of any regional actor. Each generation was, in its own narrow terms, correct about the immediate capabilities of its weapons, and each generation was wrong about the deeper question, which was whether those weapons could permanently overcome the structural advantages that narrow geography grants to whoever sits on its shores. They could not. They have not. The geometry of the strait has outlasted every technology deployed against it. The weapons change. The names of the empires change. The specific tactics and the specific justifications change. But the corridor remains exactly the width it has always been. And the rules that govern what happens when global trade is forced through a narrow passage have not been altered by any invention or any doctrine. This is not a failure of planning or imagination or resolve. It is, in the deepest sense, a consequence of physics operating at a scale that human ingenuity has not learned to transcend. Three truths emerge from this long record, and they are worth stating plainly because each generation seems to encounter them only during the crises that force them into view and then to forget them once the immediate pressure recedes. The first truth is that global prosperity, the astonishing complexity of modern commerce and industry and food production, rests on fragile physical corridors that no amount of financial engineering or technological sophistication can replace. Supply chains can be optimized. Logistics can be computerized. Just-in-time delivery can be orchestrated with algorithmic precision. None of that changes the fact that somewhere in the chain, physical goods still have to move through specific physical routes. And some of those routes are irreplaceable. The Strait of Hormuz is not the only such corridor. It is simply the most stark and most quantifiable example of a broader condition. The second truth is that the weak can still weaponize location against the strong. This is not a bug in the international system that better diplomacy or stronger institutions can eventually fix. It is a permanent structural feature of geography. As long as narrow passages exist and as long as trade must pass through them, the actors who control their shores will retain leverage that has nothing to do with their conventional military power or their economic weight. Iran's position at the northern edge of the Strait of Hormuz gives it an ability to affect global markets that it could never achieve through any other means. Remove Iran from that shoreline and some other actor would inherit the same leverage from the same geography. The leverage belongs to the location, not to any particular nation that happens to occupy it in a given century. The third truth is the most uncomfortable, and it applies not to governments or armies, but to us. The broader human capacity for collective memory. Each generation rediscovers, usually during a crisis, that supply chains are only as secure as their narrowest point. Each generation absorbs the shock, Ondas responds to the immediate disruption, and then forgets the lesson as the crisis recedes. The forgetting is not malicious or even deliberate. It is simply what happens, almost inevitably, when the daily functioning of a complex system runs smoothly enough for long enough that the underlying fragility becomes invisible to the people who depend on it. The cost of remembering is vigilance and expense. The cost of forgetting is only paid when the next crisis arrives, and by then, the memory of the last one has faded enough to make the same mistakes plausible all over again. This is not merely a story about oil or about Iran or about the specific military strategies of the early 21st century. It is a parable about the limits of human control over the physical world. We build global systems of extraordinary complexity, systems that feed billions of people and power the machinery of modern life. And we route them through corridors that a single cluster of minds can effectively close. We treat geography as a solved problem, a backdrop against which human agency operates without constraint. And we are surprised every time when the geography reasserts itself and reminds us that it was never solved. The strait is a mirror. If you look at it carefully, you do not see the Middle East. You see yourself and the civilization you are part of. You see the dependency you did not choose, but inherited. You see the amnesia that makes complex systems feel permanent right up until the moment they prove otherwise. You see the stubborn belief woven into the assumptions of modern life that we have outgrown the constraints of the physical world, that the logistical miracles we take for granted are somehow inherent in the universe rather than contingent on narrow passages that have been the same width for 5,000 years. And so the corridor remains exactly as it always has been. 21 nautical miles of water, the same water that carried Sumerian copper and Ormus pearls and Portuguese gold, and 20 million barrels of crude oil, still narrow, still indifferent, still waiting. Picture, one last time, the bridge of a supertanker transiting the Strait of Hormuz on an ordinary day in an ordinary year. Iran rises to the north, the jagged ridges of the Zagros catching the first light of morning or the last red glow of evening, depending on when the captain happens to be making the passage. Oman's Musandam Peninsula lies to the south, its limestone cliffs dropping steeply to water that looks impossibly blue from the deck of a ship moving slowly through it. Both shores are visible at once. Both coastlines feel close enough to reach out and touch, though of course they are miles away across the calm surface of the Gulf. This is the same corridor a Sumerian merchant navigated 4,600 years ago, sitting in a wooden vessel far smaller than the ship now passing through it, carrying copper ingots or lapis lazuli, or the products of some long-forgotten workshop in Mesopotamia. The water has not changed. The mountains have not moved. The distance between the shores is exactly what it has always been. This is the same passage that Portuguese cannon tried to hold for 115 years before the alliance of Persians and English drove them out. The same channel where tankers burned in 1988 and crews abandoned ship into oil-slicked water. The same shipping lanes where mines waited in 2019 and where, in 2026, the traffic collapsed from 153 vessels per day to 13, and the world learned what it had always half known but never fully wanted to believe. 21 nautical miles, wide enough for the world's economy, narrow enough for a single mind to close. The strait does not care about the names of the empires that have tried to control it across the long sweep of recorded history. It does not respond to the evolution of weapons technology or to the shifting doctrines of distant strategists. It does not grant special consideration to whoever happens to currently occupy its shores, or to whoever happens to currently depend on its waters for their livelihood and their daily energy. It is, in the deepest possible sense, indifferent. A geological feature that existed long before human beings began building civilizations around its edges, and that will exist long after whatever civilizations we are currently building have ended or transformed into something unrecognizable to anyone alive today. The strait is not a participant in human history. It is the stage on which a substantial portion of human history has been obliged to perform for 5,000 years, and it will remain the stage for as long as the shape of the coastline holds. We live in a world that believes with quiet and largely unexamined confidence that it has conquered distance. Supply chains span oceans in containers tracked by satellite. Energy flows invisibly from wellhead to power plant to the outlet on the wall of a home halfway around the planet. Information moves at the speed of light through cables that lie forgotten on the floor of the sea. The complexity is so vast, so seamless, so reliable in its daily operation that it begins to feel permanent, like weather or gravity or the rotation of the earth, something that simply is rather than something that has been painstakingly constructed and that continues to depend at every moment on assumptions that could fail. And then a 39-kilometer corridor at the mouth of the Persian Gulf reminds us that it is not permanent, that everything we have built passes through narrow points we prefer not to think about, that the physical world, the actual geography of coastlines and depths and distances, still has the final word on what is possible and what is not. That no matter how many layers of financial engineering and technological sophistication we have placed on top of it, the foundation is still the shape of the shore and the width of the passage and the patience of whoever happens to be sitting at the corridor's edge. There is something almost restful in that recognition. Once the initial alarm subsides and the mind has a chance to settle into it, not because the vulnerability disappears, but because the illusion of total control was always more exhausting than the quiet acceptance of limits. We did not build the strait. We did not choose its width or its location. We inherited it, and our only real options are to understand it honestly or to pretend it does not matter until the next crisis teaches us otherwise. The oil that heated your room tonight, wherever in the world you happen to be listening from, may have passed through this corridor on its way to you. The fuel in the vehicle parked outside your home may have begun its long journey there in the waters between Iran and Oman. The plastic in the objects scattered around you, the fertilizer that grew the food in your kitchen, the synthetic fibers in the clothes you are wearing right now, all of it may trace its molecular chemistry back to a single drop that once moved through the strait on a ship crossing the narrowest point on the map. That thought does not require any particular response. It is simply something to know. The narrowest point on the map is also the narrowest point in our confidence that the modern world is as stable as it feels from moment to moment. It has always been the narrowest point. It will continue to be the narrowest point long after this particular crisis has faded into the history books and been replaced by other concerns, other crises, other reminders of the same quiet truth. For now, the corridor is still there, exactly as it has always been. The sun still rises over the Zagros Mountains on the Iranian shore and sets behind the limestone cliffs of Musandam. Ships still move through the shipping lanes when conditions allow them to, more of them or fewer depending on the pressures of the moment. But the passage itself does not close or open by any decision of its own. It is simply there, 21 nautical miles wide, exactly as it has always been, waiting for whatever comes next. That thought can sit with you now. As the night deepens and the day recedes and the mind drifts toward whatever comes after wakefulness. The strait will still be there in the morning. It has been there every morning for 5,000 years, and it will be there every morning for a long time yet to come.